Hi everybody, it's Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio. Today I'm going to be quilting on the vintage 9-patch quilt. Okay, here is the 9-patch quilt. I've got it loaded on the machine. I've done all the stabilizing quilting, which is stitching in the ditch around the blocks and the borders, and I've even done some marking in the outer border. What I'm going to do is a feather vine that's going to go around the quilt. I'm not certain what I'm going to do in the inner border yet, but I'm going to do cross hatching in the 9 patches, and then I'm going to come up with something to put into the alternate blocks. And I think I'm going to do feathers, but I haven't decided exactly what kind of feather I'm going to put in there. So this is what I've got so far. It's doing fine. I haven't had any trouble with it. It's the batting is a 60-40 batting by Pellon, and this is the second time I've used this batting, and I really like it. It's thinner than an 80-20, but it's very stable. It's got a scrim on the back side of it, and I just put the scrim side down, and that makes it stable. It doesn't make as much lint as the 80-20 battings do, so I'm really liking it. Other than, you know, it doesn't have the same loft, but I think it's pretty good, so I think that's a good option, and I'll be using that more in the future. So anyway, I am about ready to get started on that outer border, and I do usually quilt my outer border first, then my inner border, and then I work in the body of the quilt. And when I make quilts, I usually only have 2 borders. I don't usually put more than that on there, and just because that's the look I like. There's no other reason for that. And the backing is the same fabric that is in the alternate blocks. So my AC is getting ready to kick on, so I'll turn off the video for now and get back in a few minutes. I'm starting the quilting in the corner of the quilt in this border and quilting the feather in. This will be a feather swag, and those feathers will start in the corners of each border and then end in the center. So the spine was drawn in first, and I used my swirls ruler to draw that in, and then I just quilted it on top of following the lines without using the ruler. That gives me a little smoother spine than if I use that ruler as a guide for the hopping foot. And the feathers are not all the same length. They are varying, so they don't end all at one point of the border, so it gives them a little bit more motion and makes them a little bit more interesting, I think. And the thread that I'm using is Signature 100% cotton, and it's a 40 weight thread, and the color is parchment, and I think that blends really well with the fabric that I have here. Now when I'm quilting feathers like this with a curved spine, the feathers get to a point where they want to lay down horizontally up against the spine, and so when I get to that point, what I do is quilt in a short feather and go ahead and lay that down up against the spine so it is pretty parallel to the spine, and then build the feathers up around that, and that kind of keeps them from all laying down. It gives the feather a little bit more interest too, and I like the look myself. There are other ways to do that, but that's one of my favorite ways to do feathers. Now these are just regular plain formal feathers. There's nothing fancy about them. There's no loops in them. There's no extra spines. There's no curls. There's no hooks. It's just a simple plain formal feather. So there's nothing elaborate about them, other than feathers are just a little bit elaborate themselves. Now, when I quilt a feather, feathers are time consuming. For me, they're not difficult because I've been quilting them for 18 plus years, and I'm very familiar with them, and I'm very comfortable with quilting them. But they are still time consuming. They do take time, and I prefer to quilt them in a solid color fabric as opposed to a print, especially a busy print, because they won't show up as well if they're in a busy print. And I don't like to waste my time and effort quilting something that isn't going to show. So I normally only do these in a solid colored fabric. But this fabric here is mostly background. There's little tiny stars in it, but there's more of the background showing than there is of the print. So I felt this was a good fabric to do a feather in. And I've been doing a lot of feathers lately, but I've also been doing a lot of vintage quilts. And if the piecing comes together and looks really good, then I want to do something special in the quilt. And so I will put feathers in if the design calls for it. And since this one has a lot of solid fabric in it, I felt this was a good candidate for feathers. Now, in these alternate blocks, I also put a feather, but I didn't want it to fill up the entire space. So I decided to put in a feather on point, and to do that, I'm making a square and putting it on point. So I found the center of each side of the block and marked that, and then I drew lines that are connecting those points from one point to the next, and then that gives me a box to put my feather in. And now I'm going to find the center of that box that I just drew, which should be the center of the block itself. So I'm finding the center here by just drawing a little X in there, and then I'll draw in my feathers. Now, I don't draw the feathers in every single block that I quilt, but on this quilt I did draw the corner feathers in on every block and just left the other feathers out and just free-handed those in. And that just helps me with my spacing to make sure that I'm getting things pretty even. I wanted 2 feathers between each of the corner feathers, and that way I know how much space the large feather is going to take, so then I can put in those other 2 feathers and get them spaced equally. Now I decided to do more lines to kind of copy what's going to be quilted into the 9-patch blocks. So I'm putting in 2 sets of lines that are 1/4 inch apart each, and then there's a 1/2 inch between each one of those sets. So I'm just using my rotary cutting ruler and drawing those lines in. And this also will copy what's going on in the blocks, the pieced blocks. It has the diagonal lines in it and just kind of helps blend everything together. Now here I decided the spacing wasn't quite what I wanted, so I'm trying something different. And I decided I needed more space between the 2 sets. So I got one of my paint brushes that I use for acrylic painting, and it's clean, and I just wet it with some tap water and used it to erase the lines that I don't want. And then I'll draw in more lines to finish the design. And you can do this with a Q-tip and water, or anything else that you think will work, a cotton ball or whatever. I just didn't want to spray this block because it would get everywhere, and then I'd have to wait for the entire block to dry before I could do any more marking on it. And so this was a solution that worked pretty well for me. And then I'm finishing up the lines for this design, and I think you'll see that that spacing is a little better. And you could also quilt something between those 2 sections if you wanted, but I decided to just leave that space open without any quilting in it. But there's the finished design, and then I'll just get the machine set up and quilt that design in. Now with this design, I decided to do all the line work first, and I have my yellow ruler here, and this is a ruler by Rob's Rulers, I believe. Rob's Rulers, I think. I don't know if that company is in business anymore. I've had this ruler for 18 years, so I really like it. It's a good width for my hand, and it's long enough that I can do almost any job with it that I have. But you can use any size ruler that you like that has a straight edge on it. It can be shorter, it can be wider, whatever you like is what you need to use. So I worked out a path where I could get around this block and quilt all those straight lines in without stopping or starting. It just required doing some stitch in the ditch work to get from one point to the other once I got finished quilting around this diamond shape here. And I just had to stitch in the ditch to get down to the corners and quilt those areas in. And I did try several different pathways, and there wasn't one that was any better than the other. They all required doing some stitch in the ditch, so and none of them was quicker than the other, so it really didn't matter. And after doing a couple of blocks, I found a path that I was comfortable with and just stuck with that. So you may find out for yourself that it also will take a couple of pathways to help you figure that out. And of course you can practice that on paper or just with tracing the design with your finger and figure out what pathway is going to work best for you. But I tend to just get in there and start quilting and then figure it out as I go. So now the line work is done, and then I'll start doing the feather, and I'll start that feather in the center of the block and work it out from there. But you can also start at the tip of the feather if you want instead of at the base. It's another personal preference, whatever works best for you. And in this particular block, I did follow the lines that I drew pretty closely. And I don't normally do that because that if I try to stick right to that line, keep right on top of it, the line gets shaky. My quilting gets shaky. It's just a little hard to do for me. So I usually just use that as a guideline for my spacing and then kind of just freehand it in from that point. But this one, the freehanding and the line drawing was pretty close together, so I think it turned out to be pretty well spaced. And that feather goes pretty quickly because there aren't very many petals in it. It's not a very big feather. So now I'm adjusting my side light so that you can see that feather a little better. That's why you're seeing shadows kind of coming and going, because I'm moving that light around, trying to find the best view. And now I'm going to work on the 9 patches. Now these are just cross-hatched, and I started in one corner and went down to the opposite corner and then move over to the next piece of the block and just continue quilting. And when you're working on something like a 9 patch or a group of blocks and you're doing these cross hatching, you may find that not every single piece within that block is the same size. Now, since I had to trim these blocks down, the pieces that are in the center of the block are a little bit larger than those that are on the outside. And like this piece here is quite a bit larger than the one I'm quilting now. So what I do in that instance, since the line of quilting is, if I quilted right along my ruler and ignored the piecing itself, the line would be straight, but it wouldn't end up in the corners of each piece. And to me, that would look worse than having the quilting that isn't perfectly straight. And I don't know if you can, if I'm explaining that very well, but I learned to do that early on. One of the first quilts I ever quilted for a customer was a Irish chain. So, you know, you have a lot of small squares in that, and none of the points matched in that Irish chain. And I learned real fast that it was just a better look if the quilting went from point to point as opposed to being completely straight. And you might be able to see that in this block here in the gray squares, how the quilting isn't perfectly straight, but it is lined up from point to point. Now for the inner border, I decided to keep it simple, and I put a curved line of quilting in there. Now these blocks are 5.5 inches finished, and I used a 7-inch circle as my guide for the curved lines. And that's all they are, is curved lines, and I used the piecing to guide me as far as how big those curved lines were. And then in the corner of the sashing, or the corner of the border, I put 3 little petals in there. There were a lot of things I could have done. I could have added some feathers in there. I could have put some petals between each of the curves. I could add extra lines of quilting, but chose not to. And here's the finished quilt. It's not bound, but it is trimmed, and I've got it up on the design wall so we can get a good look at it. And I was real pleased with the way it turned out. I think it's got a nice look for a vintage quilt. And there's the feathers in the alternate blocks are a little bit more modern, but they still copy fairly close what is going on in the patchwork. So I was real happy with that, and everything's kind of cross-pollinated. There's feathers in the outer border and feathers in the body of the quilt, so those kind of mimic each other too. So that to me gave it a nice cohesive look. And here's one of the alternate blocks. And then here's one of the piece blocks. And here you can see how that quilting is going from point to point in those individual pieces in the block. And here's the border. You can see the center where the 2 feathers come together. And then here is a corner, so you can see how the quilting does show up on this fabric, even though it's a print, but it's a print with mostly background in it. It's a light print. And here is another corner. So overall, I was really happy with the way this turned out. And then here's the final quilt. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you'll give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and click the notification bell so you'll be notified when the next video comes up. And don't forget to share it with your quilting friends. And in the meantime, I hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. For more quilting ideas, click on the video links. And to keep up with my latest projects, click on the subscribe button. I hope to see you again soon.